Welcome to Bitcoin and Digital Currency, the Future of Money. So there's three takeaways that I'd like you to take from this talk. The first is, what is Bitcoin? It's not completely obvious. You may have heard about it in the news, but it's a bit of a new way of looking at currency. So we need to cover that. Why does it matter? And how do you use Bitcoins if you decide that it does matter? There are two perspectives from which to approach this, or at least two. There's technological, which is what I'm going to cover today, and social, which I'll cover next time. In both the technological and the social spheres, the key concept is the concept of decentralization. What do I mean by decentralization? Well, I'll give you an example. If you remember the old days of file sharing, there was Napster. That got shut down because it was easy to shut down. Napster had a centralized server that people would upload stolen music to, and then other people would download it. All you need to shut down something like that is a court order, and you just walk into the server farm and unplug those computers, and Napster is dead. As an answer to that, as an answer to Napster's centralized model, BitTorrent came around. BitTorrent's a lot different because the data doesn't exist on a central server. Rather, it exists in a peer-to-peer network, which means that every person keyed into that network can have a piece of the file or the whole file. And even if you were able to shut down one or two of those nodes, you would never be able to shut down the entire file. It's structured very much like the internet was intended to work in that way, where if a couple of the nodes were taken out, the internet could still function. So, as the analogy goes, traditional banks, like Goliath National Bank up top, runs on a centralized server. When you make transactions, the transaction goes back and looks, at your account on the centralized server, makes sure you have enough money to cover the transaction, and then records that transaction again in the centralized place. Bitcoin's much more like BitTorrent is, in that it's a peer-to-peer distributed decentralized network. That is, there's no centralized server where the transactions are validated and new transactions are logged. So there are problems with decentralization, especially when it comes to currency. Trust is the biggest one. And as sort of a corollary of that, we have something called the double spending problem. So digital money has no choice but to exist as a computer file of some type. But the interesting thing about computer files, of course, is that they can be copied. And if you had, let's say in a simple sense, you had $1 in a computer file on your computer, what would stop you from copying that dollar a million times or more? And the incentive to do so would be pretty great. Unfortunately, any kind of economy where money could just be duplicated by any of the participants would not be a stable or sustainable economy. So obviously we can't have that. So the double spending problem is basically that you can have $1, the exact self-identical dollar, and spend it in two different places. The same dollar gets you a candy bar at two different stores, for example. How do we stop that with digital currency? So the solution is to give everyone a ledger. Just like the bank has a ledger, a single ledger in the centralized system, in Bitcoin and decentralized cryptocurrencies, you get a ledger for everyone. But of course, this only works if everyone's honest. If everyone modifies their own ledger, let's say I decided to put in my ledger that, somebody donated me $1 million, and let's say everybody else did the same thing, of course, for their own benefit. How do we decide which ledger is authoritative? So Bitcoin is the first cryptocurrency, and it's the first innovation that solved these problems. So what is a cryptocurrency? Let's take a little bit of a deeper dive. Well, of course, crypto is an abbreviation of the word cryptography, which means the art of writing or solving codes. Now, humanity's been doing this for a long time, but more recently, in the digital age, we use cryptography to keep data safe. We use it when we do online banking. If you have secret messages you need to send, there are a couple services like Wickr, for example, that allow you to send encrypted chat messages. There's PGP for email that allows you to send encrypted email messages. We can also use it for identity verification so that you know that somebody who sent the message is actually who they say they are. And you can use it to encrypt the data on your hard disks, for example, to keep the data on your hard drive safe. So even if your computer was turned off, somebody came in and stole your hard drive, without the decryption key, they wouldn't be able to access any of the data on your hard drive. So let's take a look at a couple of these cryptographic methods that Bitcoin uses. There's two of them in particular that we're going to cover. The first is SHA-256. This was developed in part by the NSA, and SHA stands for Secure Hash Algorithm. And this is not the kind of encryption where you encrypt the plain text to a ciphertext and then are able to decrypt it again to read it. This is what's called a hashing algorithm, which takes plain text and turns it into, there's the algorithm running right there, and turns it into this alphanumeric string. Now the alphanumeric string is always of the same length, but it's always different. If you look at that same string, this alphanumeric string just below our algorithm machine there is hexadecimal notation. Underneath that is decimal notation, so 256 bits or digits of binary, which is where you get the SHA-256 from. And if you turn that into a base 10 integer, it's this very, very long 78-digit number. So as you can imagine, you can take a plain text of any size, run it through a hashing algorithm, and you're going to get the equivalent of that bottom integer there, which you can imagine that's a lot of digits. That provides a lot of opportunity for uniqueness. Here are some features of the hashing algorithm. It's consistent, so given the same input, the algorithm will always give the same output. It's unpredictable, so even though that's the case, there's no way to know ahead of running the algorithm what the output will be. You don't even know, for example, let's say you have a given integer of around 78 or fewer digits. There's no way to know whether the integer that's going to be produced by the hashing algorithm is higher or lower than that arbitrary integer. It's collision resistant, which means that it's very unlikely you'll ever find two messages that result in the same hash. And the unlikelihood that we're talking about here is, astronomical, on the astronomical order. And my own technical term, it's unreverse engineerable. So given only the hashed output, it's computationally infeasible to derive the original message, especially because we know in the case of SHA-256 that the original message could be of any length, and it always boils it down to the hash of a particular length. So taking a bit closer of a look at the unreverse engineerable feature, it's kind of like gravity. It takes advantage of a law of nature such that it's easier to go in one direction than it is to go in the other. So if you jump out of a plane, because of the laws of nature, it's very easy to go down and very, very difficult to go up. And it's much the same in cryptography. The algorithms that are run make it so that it's really easy to go in one direction. It's really easy to encrypt the information, and really difficult without the proper keys, of course, and in the case of SHA-256, pretty much impossible in general to go in the other direction. Pretty much impossible to take that hash, the resulting hash of the algorithm, and figure out what the original plain text message was. And how did they do that? Well, there's this neat feature of nature that when you take a large prime number and you multiply it by another large prime number, you get a number that's ridiculously hard to factor. Now, most of our modern cryptography is based upon features of mathematics like this, that pretty much the only way to factor in a number of which is a product of two primes is by trial and error. So you have to basically try every combination of prime numbers to find the factor, and doing so for a number as large as that 78-digit integer would pretty much take something like the age of the universe to be able to crack, or at least a computationally infeasible large amount of time. Now, when quantum computers come along, that may sort of blow a lot of the current cryptographic methods out of the water. But of course, then hopefully we'll have quantum computers to also encrypt. So although these algorithms might change in the future, the basic principle is the same. So let's take a closer look at the authoritative ledger issue. So how is the SHA-256 hashing that we just discovered, how is it used to solve the problem of the authoritative ledger? Well, it's based upon a contest. Now, I'm going to get more into this in a moment, but there are different players in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Some people are just users of the money and they just make transactions. But there is another really important part of the Bitcoin ecosystem, and these are called miners. Now, you can call a person a miner, but more accurately, really, it's a computer or a chip that's doing the mining. And what do they mean by Bitcoin mining? Well, this is pretty much just it. There is a contest that's run on, so every 10 minutes, all of the transactions that are made in Bitcoin around the world are broadcast to all of these, to everyone on the network, really. And all of the mining computers, they take that record of transactions that's occurred in the 10-minute epoch and they record it in a block. Now, how we solve the problem of the authoritative ledger is that one of these blocks in general, and I'll get to an exception in just a moment, but one of these blocks in general is the authoritative record of all the transactions made in that 10 minutes. And who has that authoritative record? Well, this is where the contest is run. So what happens is the computers that are recording all of these transactions, the miners, they take the hash of the previous block. So remember, you can have an input into a SHA-256 hash that's any length. It can contain any type of characters, and you're going to get this unpredictable, unrepeatable, unreverse engineerable hash out of it once you run it through the hashing algorithm. So you have a unique identifier of that last block. And then what they do is they iterate over some kind of an integer and run it again and add that to the block hash of the last block, and then run it again through a hashing algorithm. And the contest is just to see who can find an integer smaller than a network-wide difficulty level that's broadcast to everyone. And so essentially, remember, when you're hashing, you can't know ahead of time, ahead of running the actual algorithm, whether or not your number, your resulting number, is going to be higher or lower than some arbitrary integer. And so the system sets this arbitrary integer as a difficulty level, and you have to find a, where the question mark is there just prior to, actually I think I can do this, right there. You have to find what that value is that's going to give you a hashed output that's smaller than the difficulty level, and that's the contest. The first computer to do that wins that particular block. And as a miner, you actually get rewarded in Bitcoins for having done that. And that is the only way that new Bitcoins come into the system. So like I said, so the first one to find that integer smaller than the difficulty level wins the prize of Bitcoins. And then their ledger becomes the authoritative ledger, or the authoritative block that's added to the network's ledger. And so that is called mining. When the right value is found, it's really easy for everyone else to identify that the solution has been found, because remember, it's really easy to go forwards in hashing. It's really easy to take the hash of the last block and then whatever number and find out what the answer is. It's really hard to know what that's going to be ahead of time, but once it's been found, it's super easy for everyone on the network to just run that algorithm and say, oh yeah, that person's found the solution. And this is what we call a proof of work. So when the miner has mined the block successfully, which means that they've won that contest, they broadcast their proof of work to the rest of the network, and that's the way that the rest of the network knows that they are the winner, and it's mathematically guaranteed that they're the winner. So this does a couple things. It guarantees that the current block, which is that block of all the transactions in a 10-minute period, is a continuation of the prior block. Why does it guarantee that it's a continuation? Because remember, that block hash that we start with is the hash of the prior block. And it gives criteria for which is the authoritative ledger, which is the contest, of course. Now, when these blocks are put together, linked by these hashing algorithms, you get something called the blockchain, which is just a chain of blocks linked together by the hashes of the previous blocks. And that's the way in which we guarantee that the current block is a continuation of the prior block. You might have also heard this term blockchain, because next to the term Bitcoin itself, the blockchain is probably one of the greatest innovations of Bitcoin. And there are a lot of new technologies emerging just using blockchain technology that aren't even financial in nature. So how does this solve the double spending problem? Well, no block can be accepted by the network where any of the inputs to a transaction within the block has already been spent. So if somebody comes and says, okay, well, I have this, this block that's a continuation of the previous block and I've been the first to mine it, but where there is an input ID, which is basically money coming out of somebody's wallet, that has already been spent, that block won't be accepted. So that's one of the ways in which the double spending problem is solved. And of course, the total number of Bitcoins within the system, within the network, within the Bitcoin economy must be the same for each block, plus the prize that was given for the mining of the block that was just mined. So let's say that somebody, so what we've covered so far is what happens if you try to spend money in this block that's already been spent in a previous block. So we've limited double spending in that way. But what if you get really clever and you say, well, I'm going to try to spend the same money in the same block. Now, wallets won't let you do that, what they call Bitcoin wallets, which is basically a software interface to allow you to send and receive money. Wallets won't let you do that, but if you get into the code and actually program something on your own, you could try something like this. So you could try to spend the exact same Bitcoin twice in two different places in the same 10-minute period, and what we've said so far doesn't prevent against that. So what happens in that case? Well, essentially, there is no way to guarantee which of the transactions a certain computer on the network is going to receive first. So let's say you spend some of that Bitcoin money at McDonald's, and then you spend some of that Bitcoin money at Harvey's in the same 10 minutes. Even though in reality the McDonald's one may have come first, because of the geographical location of where those are being spent and the geographical location of the mining equipment, it's possible that the Harvey's transaction might land on some of the computers first. So just like real temporal priority doesn't determine which of those spends is the valid or the accurate spend. So what happens is some computers will start mining the first transaction, and some computers will start mining blocks with the second transaction, and you actually get what's called a fork, where the blockchain splits off into two different blocks, and so you get the McDonald's transaction on the right, for example, and the Harvey's transaction on the left, for example. And there's basically, it forks off into almost two different versions of reality. Well, of course, that's not a very good situation because Paul here might give some money to Vicky and might give some money to Adam in the same block, and one of them is, he can't have been successful or else the double spending problem is real. So how does Bitcoin prevent against that? Well, what happens is it doesn't really prevent against it right away. Rather, the solution is temporally extended. It's extended in time. So what happens is there actually are two different now blockchains resulting from the forking of that single blockchain. And so what happens is the original double spend blocks get mined, and then the rest of the mining computers, some fraction of the mining computers in the world mine the left block, and some fraction of the mining computers in the world mine the right block, and they just sort of continue. However, there's a feature built into these blocks, and that's that each block records a difficulty of mining that particular block. And it has to do with the difficulty level of the network at the time the block was mined. It has to do with a bunch of different factors. But that block difficulty is sort of inherited by the chain that comes after it, the chain of blocks that comes after it, and it can compound. So let's say the first block on the left here, that has, just for easy figuring, let's say that's got difficulty 10, and then this one has difficulty 10. So then these are going to compound and say, add up to difficulty 100. It's not necessarily the math that's used, but it's for easy illustration. Whereas let's say this difficulty was 5 and this difficulty was 10 on this block. So then what you're going to get is after 2 blocks, your difficulty is only going to be 50, much lower than the other one. And so what eventually happens is that as all the computers in the network get wind of these two different chains, these two different blockchains that are evolving, they will eventually all converge on the chain that has the highest difficulty rating overall. And when you spend money in Bitcoin, you have these things called confirmations. And this is why the confirmation system exists, and why when you if you're a merchant and you're selling something to somebody and you're accepting payments in Bitcoin, this is why you're going to want to wait for at least a couple confirmations before accepting the transaction is closed. Because we see here what happens on the left is after one confirmation, as we saw, we have the difficulty, difficulty marked by a D. That's the one that's winning the difficulty. And so the networks are gradually going to converge on this chain and is going to leave out this chain. But in the meantime, let's say you only wait for one confirmation, this block is still around in the network. And it could be the legitimate block still. So you won't really know until a couple confirmations have happened and the network starts converging around this particular chain. You won't know that that's the correct block. So when you're a merchant and you're selling products or services for Bitcoin, you want to wait for a couple confirmations, because after a couple confirmations, it becomes fairly obvious to the network that if there is a double spend problem, that one of those lineages, one of those blockchain lines after the fork is going to be converged upon and the other one is going to be discarded. Now this forking doesn't happen all the time because there's this safety mechanism built into the system, and because it means that eventually you're not going to actually be able to double spend. You're not actually going to be able to spend the same money twice. It really robs anyone of the incentive to actually try double spending because it's technically difficult, and if it's not going to work in the long run anyways, why do it, right? So the double spending doesn't happen a lot. One of the interesting results, though, of this particular system is that this guy right here, when this blockchain becomes invalidated, he doesn't end up getting his money. So if he just accepted this guy's Bitcoins and then walked away, pretty soon he's going to realize that he didn't actually get the money. The money's going to come out of his wallet. and he's going to say, I should have waited for more confirmations. The other interesting thing that happens is, remember, there are still some miners mining these other blocks, and they're doing it hoping for that Bitcoin reward at the end of their block mining when they've been successful at winning the contest. But of course, once this blockchain is invalidated, any Bitcoins that those miners got from mining those blocks evaporates. So it's not a good system, but well, it's not a good situation, sorry, for the miners or for the people who've accepted money on that double spend. But like I say, it doesn't happen often because there's a real disincentive built into the system. And this is just showing that the confirmations can go on for forever. Pretty much every time a new block is mined, you get a confirmation. And the more confirmations you have, the more sure you are that the transaction has happened as you want. How many confirmations should you wait? Well, if it's just a cup of coffee, sometimes people wait 0 confirmations. Because double spends don't happen that often, and because somebody's probably not motivated to try a double spend on something as small as a cup of coffee, once you have that transaction initially broadcast to the network, you could say, okay, I accept that. Here's your cup of coffee, take it and go. If it's for something more, if you're buying a car or a house with Bitcoin, you're going to want to wait a number of confirmations to ensure that that went through okay. And so it depends on your whether or not you're risk averse. So transactions for larger value, you should wait for more confirmations. So how does sending money work on Bitcoin? This is the second type of encryption that Bitcoin uses next to the SHA-256 algorithm. And this is public key encryption. Now this is something that you use when you go online to do your banking, and it's something that's used in those secret messages that we talked about a little bit earlier. This is the kind of encryption where you have a message that you want to send to somebody safely, and you want them to be able to decrypt it and read it on the other end. So here's Bob and Alice, and Bob is going to send Alice some money. So both of them, as a part of their Bitcoin wallet, which is a piece of software, and I'll show you that a little bit later, it's a piece of software that interacts with the Bitcoin ecosystem that allows you to keep track of how much money you have, and it allows you to send and receive money. Alongside this wallet, you have this secret key. Now this secret key, just like all secret keys in encryption, are meant to be shared with nobody. It's meant to be hidden away and kept very, very safe because it is really the key to your kingdom. And in the case of Bitcoin, it could be the key to your financial kingdom. Now, one of the interesting things about public key encryption is that you can use your secret key to generate a public key. So this is a public key right here. Now the public key can be sent around anywhere. It can be posted online for people to use. And this is what a lot of people do when they want to receive encrypted emails. The secret key will generate a public key. Now the public key cannot decrypt messages. The public key can only be used to encrypt messages. So it's safe to put this public key out in the wild. The secret key is the only thing that will be able to decrypt the message that's been encrypted with the public key. So Alice then, she wants some money, so she has her secret key that's made available through her Bitcoin wallet. And so what Bob does is he takes Alice's public key and he uses his own secret key to sign a message that just has Bob's address, Bob's Bitcoin address. This is what a Bitcoin address looks like. It's kind of like an email address, only you can generate a lot of them at will, and they're a lot less readable and memorizable. Your wallets can keep track of these as well. And you put Alice's Bitcoin address, and you put the amount, and then you sign it with her public key and your secret key, and it goes into this algorithm, and it makes this little package that there's only 2 people in the world who can prove a relationship to this package. One is Alice, because her secret key will open the lock, and one is Bob, because his secret key can provably open the lock as well. And those packages are distributed to everybody on the network. everybody gets that record of that transaction that just happened. But of course, remember, only Alice can open the box with her secret key. And so that's how you prove that the money is yours on the Bitcoin network, is because of your secret key, your private key. So let's look a little bit at transaction fees. One of the reasons that Bitcoin became as popular as it is because it allows you to send money, for example, overseas for really no extra fee. There are currently no mandatory fees, whereas something like Western Union or wire transfer services cost quite a bit of money. They take a fairly serious percentage of the money to send it overseas. Now, you can include an optional transaction fee as an incentive for the miners to include the transaction in the blocks that they mine. Because the miners, if they mine a block successfully, not only get the reward for that contest, but they also get any transaction fees that were used in that 10-minute period of time of the block that they mine. Now, the transaction fees may become more relevant in the future, and I'll tell you just in a moment about how that can be. First, let's take a look at why does Bitcoin matter from the technological perspective. Well, it solves some problems in decentralized digital currency that were previously unsolved. So the blockchain is a great technology, and the way that it uses encryption to prove ownership of money and also stop double spending problems, allows a distributed ledger where everybody can agree on it, where there's no centralized or authoritative source. It's really a great innovation in that space. And of course, it makes decentralized digital currency possible. Now, that's sort of an allusion to the sociological implications of Bitcoin, which we'll talk about more in the next part. And the blockchain itself is a major innovation. It could be used for other applications. If we go back to this slide, remember, the message is broadcast to the entire network. Everybody gets a piece, but only Alice can prove ownership of that money in that package because she has a secret key. Well, for example, there are messaging services that piggyback on cryptocurrency blockchains and take advantage of this very process. If you think about the Edward Snowden revelations and the fact that the NSA was very interested in gobbling up metadata of communications, you can realize why this is important. Because the metadata of the communication can sometimes be more valuable than the content itself. If you have a lot of metadata, you can tell who people are talking to, when, and you can infer a lot from that. For example, if one person continually calls one of those like abortion clinics or something like that, what do they call them in the States? They're always being picketed, protested. Then you know, well, look, either they work there, and you can find that out relatively easy enough, or there's something going on in their personal life that necessitates that, right? So metadata can be very, very revealing. But in this particular case, you get a case where the package is encrypted, sent out to everyone, but only one person can open it. And then in that way, you can't collect the metadata of who's talking to who because you have no way of knowing as somebody observing that network. So where do you get Bitcoins if you decide that you want one? Well, you can go to in-person exchanges. The last time I looked, there's a couple University of Waterloo meetups that have Bitcoin exchanges. And in this case, two people can just bring their smartphones. One person hands the other person cash. They decide upon an exchange rate, and then they just transfer the Bitcoins from one to the other. It's as simple as that. There are also Bitcoin ATMs that allow you to use Visa, MasterCard, debit to essentially withdraw Bitcoins. And how do you withdraw something that doesn't have a physical manifestation? Well, you can actually have a secret key sort of printed out, and you can use that to import your Bitcoins into your wallet. There are also Bitcoin exchanges. This Kraken exchange that you see on the screen here, this recently has been just going around buying up all sorts of previous Bitcoin exchanges, including the leading Canadian Bitcoin exchange as well. The Bitcoin exchange works very much like, kind of like a stock market, very much like an eBay for money almost. It's a kind of auction process where people will bid on Bitcoins with real dollars, and the exchange rate is basically what the last bid was and what people are willing to pay. Now, unfortunately, unlike regular money. There's no gold standard, although I believe that the gold standard has sort of lifted away from our economy currently. But also the money's not backed up. Bitcoin's not backed up by any stocks or bonds or anything like that. So the Bitcoin price can fluctuate wildly. Pretty much the only thing determining its worth is how much people are willing to pay for it. But the technology itself is valuable enough, and the things that the technology allows you to do is valuable enough that people actually do find value in this. And the exchange rate now, I think, is somewhere in around $100 to $200 US for one Bitcoin. So I referred to the wallet before, the Bitcoin wallet. So where do you keep your Bitcoins? And this is a Windows client wallet. This is kind of the standard original Bitcoin wallet. Now you have a lot of cloud-based wallet offerings. The disadvantage of running the wallet on your own computer, of course, is that you have to keep a copy. You're part of the network, so you have to keep a copy of that blockchain, of all of the transactions in the Bitcoin world that have happened since the original Genesis block was mined back in, I think it was 2008. So you can see here with the wallet, you have an overview. You can see your balance, how many BTC or Bitcoins you have. It lists the number of transactions. It lists the recent transactions. And of course, you can also go to the Send tab to send Bitcoin to an address. You can receive Bitcoins at your Bitcoin address, and you can also generate new Bitcoin addresses. You can generate a new Bitcoin address for every single transaction if you like, so that it's more difficult to trace you. There's a transaction listing, and of course an address book, because if people can generate Bitcoin addresses at will, you often need to keep track of whose address is whose, especially because they tend not to be very memorable. So Bitcoin is often considered to be an anonymous way of transacting. So how do you use it if you want to do crime? You know, for those aspiring mafia bosses out there. On the web, you can see a list of every single Bitcoin transaction as it occurs in real time. If you go to some place like blockchain.info, you can actually see on their front page all of those Bitcoin transactions just flying by you as they occur. Of course, your name or identifying information is not associated with that. The only thing that it knows is what address it's coming from, what address it's going to, and how many Bitcoins are being sent. So it is in some way anonymous. But there's a bit of a paradox there, because at the same time, the Bitcoin transactions are broadcast publicly for everyone to see. So it's a strange kind of anonymity that some people call pseudo-anonymity. There are also these Bitcoin mixing services. So you can imagine that if you're using the same address all the time, for example, or if you're provably, often using a bunch of a series of addresses, you might be able to track people down via statistical methodologies. So there are these Bitcoin mixing services that are typically available on the dark web or the deep web using the Tor network. And that's not something that you can access just online from your regular Internet Explorer or Chrome browser. You either have to have a plugin that connects you, or you have to know networking enough to be able to get your computer onto that special Tor network. It's a network that moves slowly because everything's not only encrypted, but runs through a bunch of layers of protection, kind of like the layers of the onion, which is why Tor has this onion in its logo, and also the addresses on the Tor network are .onion. So you can go to these sites and you can deposit Bitcoins into an account. Now what happens there is when you deposit Bitcoins into the account, your account remembers how many Bitcoins you've contributed, but all of the Bitcoins go into the same address. They all go into the same pool. And then when you let it sit there for a long time, you can eventually withdraw it in different denominations than you originally put it in over different time scales. So there's really no way to track which of that money is yours coming out. Because remember, you can withdraw it to a different address than what you put it in with. So by using this, it makes that public ledger a lot less accessible to would-be spies. And there are these people. Meet Sarah Meiklejohn. She is from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of California, San Diego. She's a PhD student there, and one of her papers that she wrote with some collaborators is A Fistful of Bitcoins, Characterizing Payments Among Men with No Names. And she set out to study how anonymous Bitcoin actually is. And here's a quote from an interview that she did that it's a bit long, but I thought pretty much every paragraph has something valuable in it. She says, "I think that if you are motivated and if you understand how the Bitcoin protocol works, you can stay anonymous. The caveat here is that you have to try to stay anonymous at scale. If you have a Bitcoin, then sure, you can stay anonymous. If you understand the protocol, if you use mixing services like I showed you on that last slide, or other crazy stuff, you're going to do fine. The problem is when you try to scale this up. If you have millions of dollars worth of Bitcoins, then it's going to become a lot harder to hide that number of Bitcoins in the network. When we ultimately went to track some of these big thefts, because there have been Bitcoin thefts, just as an aside, there hasn't been anybody who's successfully been able to hack the protocol. However, a lot of these exchanges and the web cloud-based wallets are just websites. And of course, hacking a website is a lot easier than hacking the Bitcoin protocol. When you hack one of those websites, you can siphon off Bitcoins. So when they went to track some of these big thefts, we saw that these attempts to do crazy things like splitting the Bitcoins, then peeling them, then aggregating the Bitcoins back together, but ultimately the fact that every transaction was publicly available was going to shoot you in the foot when you try to obscure the flow of large amounts of Bitcoins. They used various statistical methodologies to figure this out, including actually using some of the research grant money to buy Bitcoins and sell Bitcoins on some of the various exchanges. By doing that, they were able to see at least some of the addresses that the Bitcoin exchanges were able to use. And when you have Bitcoins in your account, if you've been using different deposit addresses, you'll have certain Bitcoins belonging to certain of your addresses and some belonging to other of your addresses. When you make a big transaction, your wallet can send all sorts of different denominations from your different addresses to make up the total amount of the transaction you're engaging in. So by looking at which addresses contribute to singular transactions, you can also track which pool of addresses belong to particular people. Using these kinds of methods and running them through various statistical methodologies, they were able to do some, at least, tracking of some of the Bitcoin around the system. So just before we end off, we're going to take another look at the Bitcoin ecosystem. We've spoken a lot about the users of Bitcoins, the people who can buy and sell it. We've spoken a little bit about the miners of Bitcoin, but there are probably some more questions you have about that because we haven't gone into much detail. And of course, there are the developers of Bitcoin. Let's look first at mining. So mining was originally done on an average computer CPU. But these hashes, as cheap as they are to do one at a time, those SHA-256 hashes, computationally cheap to do one at a time, when you're trying to be the first to win that contest by finding the lowest hash underneath the difficulty level of the network, when you're trying to do that, you're not content to be slow, essentially. You want to be able to try as many different hashes as you possibly can. And so they came out with these ASIC miners, these application-specific integrated circuits, whose job is just to do this SHA-256 hashing. So this is some of the mining hardware that people use. And some people do it at a very large scale. In Iceland, for example, you have these Bitcoin mining places that are just filled with these computers and different ASIC mining pieces of equipment. It's a pretty impressive getup. And Business Insider UK, who took those photographs, says Iceland it boasts three very important qualities for mining. Cheap energy, they sit on top of a lot of geothermal energy, a good internet connection, which of course if you're trying to do things fast is essential, and a cold climate. Because you wouldn't believe the heat that those ASIC miners put off. They're doing so many calculations a second, and the energy running through the circuits puts off an enormous amount of heat. So if you have to pay for the energy that you're using to mine the blocks, plus you have to pay for the energy you're using to cool down the computers that you're using, it can become really unprofitable really fast. So Iceland's one of the few places nowadays that it's actually profitable to do that kind of mining. There are other places around the world as well. Now, when you've got these ASIC miners hooked up, you need software to coordinate them and to communicate with the rest of the network. And this is just basically a DOS Windows client that's used for that purpose. When I was mining Bitcoin, this is the one that I used. It gives you some statistics of the overall network, and also it can tell you about the pool that you're contributing to. What do I mean by a pool? Well, mining is so competitive, and if you see right here, when I started mining, we were measuring the overall hash rates of the entire Bitcoin network in terahashes, but now it's gone up to petahashes on this mining pool alone. What a mining pool is a bunch of people with Bitcoin hardware get together, and instead of trying to compete against each other, they work collaboratively and cooperatively. The mining software tells you which numbers you're going to work with in that iteration that we spoke about earlier when we talked about the contest to mine a block. And so the work is distributed to everybody in the mining pool. If you mine a block successfully, like this has 610,682 active workers mining, when a block is mined successfully, you will get a component of that prize and any transaction fees associated with it that is relative to your hash power contribution. So if you're just in it for a hobby, it's probably not going to be that productive and that profitable. And for example, now the cost of electricity, because the mining is so competitive, and the cost of electricity in Canada, for example, and Ontario is so high, it's actually not very profitable. In fact, you could probably lose money trying to engage in the Bitcoin mining. So some statistics here for you. There's a limit, a hard cap, a limit of 21 million Bitcoins. So every time a block is mined, new Bitcoins come into the system as a reward for the miners, but at some point that reward money is going to run out. The difficulty that we spoke about when we were talking about the contest that the miners engage in, we said that there's a difficulty number that they're trying to get their hash to come in below. Now that difficulty number is reevaluated every 2 weeks by the software that the network runs on. It's done automatically, and it's reevaluated to compensate for the amount of hashing power. And it does that essentially so that you'll get a block mined every 10 minutes. You can imagine the more hashing power comes in online, if you didn't have that check and balance, then the blocks would be mined, every minute, every couple seconds, for example. So the difficulty is reevaluated about every 2 weeks to compensate for that increase in hashing power of the overall network. Also, the payoff or the mining prize reduces 50% every 210,000 blocks. So it becomes, in a way, less and less profitable to mine Bitcoin unless the value of Bitcoin goes up, which it might, because of course there's a limit of 21 million Bitcoins. There's a limit to how many Bitcoins there are out there. So you get what's called a deflationary economy or a deflationary currency, where the Bitcoin you have today is in principle worth more tomorrow than it is today. So that 50% reduction partly accounts for that, but it also slows down the amount of Bitcoins that get introduced into the system. However, even with that check and balance, you get your final block mined somewhere in October of 2140, if everything stays on track. That's the year 2140. And after 2140, miners will be paid only by transaction fees, which is why when I was talking about transaction fees, I said that they would probably become more relevant in the future, because as miners depend on those for their livelihood, and miners really are key to the system, transaction fees will have to go up a little bit in order to support that economy. And lastly, if we look back at the Bitcoin ecosystem, we're going to say a little bit about the developers. Currently, the Bitcoin Foundation is a nonprofit organization that takes care of the Bitcoin code. If some bugs are noticed in it or something, these are the people who are tasked with fixing it and rolling out the fix to all of the different miners, which of course is a sort of a democratically accepted process. All the miners have to accept the new versions of the code, but it's in their best interest to do so because it allows them to continue participating in the Bitcoin economy. So this is Gavin Anderson. He is the chief scientist at the Bitcoin Foundation. Now, he did not invent Bitcoin, and so the question often comes along, who did invent Bitcoin? Well, it's this person or a group of people or something named Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody has been able to discover who the actual person is who wrote this white paper back in, I believe it was 2007. This is the white paper that describes the system, and then shortly thereafter, the Bitcoin network actually came online. There have been many attempts to find out who Satoshi Nakamoto is, and there are a lot of clues that were left. For example, a lot of the spelling was British English, so maybe somebody who is part of the Commonwealth. But nobody is sure. There have been various attempts to find who that was. For example, Newsweek had published an article called The Face Behind Bitcoin, where Leah McGrath Goodman was pretty certain she had found the originator of Bitcoin, this Dorian Satoshi Nakamoto, who denies being the Satoshi Nakamoto who created Bitcoin. He is an engineer, but he lives, not a highly glamorous lifestyle, which you might expect from somebody who invented the protocol, who would have mined the first Bitcoins and presumably thousands upon thousands of them, and would have likely sold some of those when the Bitcoin price reached about $1,000 US per coin somewhere in and around 2010. So that's what I have for today to show you about Bitcoin. Today we looked at the technological elements of Bitcoin, figured out what it is, how it works, and why it matters. And for the next presentation, I'm going to focus on the sociological implications of Bitcoin. There are countries who've made it illegal to use Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin price has fluctuated dramatically because of that. There are other countries who have gone into major recessions. The banks have closed off people's access to their accounts, and people have run to Bitcoin as a way of storing money away from the government and away from the banks. What is it like when you have a deflationary economy? Right now we have an inflationary currency where new money is constantly being printed, so the value of a dollar today is going to be more than the value of a dollar tomorrow. And this encourages spending, which, as we know it, is key to a healthy economy. What happens if Bitcoin becomes a dominant economic force and we live within a deflationary economy, which encourages hoarding and saving? What happens then? There are all sorts of interesting sociological implications, and we're going to turn to those next time. Thank you.